What if I told you that there is one simple sentence, just one, that can instantly change the way a narcissist sees you forever? Not by arguing with them, not by exposing them, not by fighting them, but by doing something they fear more than anything else, removing their control over you. Most people spend years trying to deal with narcissists the wrong way. They try to explain themselves. They try to prove they're right. They try to show evidence, logic, facts. And every time they do, they think they are getting closer to winning the argument. But the truth is, the narcissist was never trying to win the argument in the first place. They were trying to win control. And the moment you understand this, everything starts to make sense. The gaslighting, the twisted stories, the constant blame shifting, the way every conversation somehow ends with you defending yourself while they walk away untouched. It's not random. It's not confusion. It's a strategy. But here is the part most people never realize. A narcissist is powerful only as long as you are emotionally reacting to them. The moment you stop reacting the way they expect, the entire game begins to collapse. Suddenly, their manipulation stops working. Their words lose their power, and the person they once controlled becomes someone they can no longer predict. That is the moment narcissists fear the most. Because when you understand the psychological game they are playing, you stop participating in it, and when you stop playing the game, the control they once had over you disappears. In this video, you're going to discover the single sentence that exposes manipulation instantly, shifts the power dynamic, and makes a narcissist realize something they never expected. You are no longer under their control. And once you truly understand this, you will never deal with manipulation the same way again. Most people believe the way to defeat a manipulative person is by arguing better. They think if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, defend their position strongly enough, or expose every lie with perfect logic, the other person will eventually back down. It feels reasonable. It feels fair. But when you are dealing with a narcissistic personality, fairness is not the game being played. Control is. A narcissist does not enter a conversation to reach truth. They enter a conversation to maintain power. And power, for them, comes from emotional reactions. Your frustration becomes their fuel. Your anger becomes their validation. Even your attempts to calmly explain yourself can become part of the system that keeps them in control. Think about how these interactions usually unfold. A narcissist makes an accusation. Often it's exaggerated. Sometimes it's completely false, but it's delivered with confidence. Immediately, your instinct is to defend yourself. You start explaining what really happened. You provide context. You correct the facts. But the moment you step into that defensive posture, something subtle has already happened. The conversation is no longer about truth. It has become about your need to prove something to them. And that shift alone gives them psychological leverage. Now they begin moving the goalpost. They interrupt. They twist your words. They suddenly bring up something unrelated from the past. You correct that too. You explain again. The conversation expands, spirals, and becomes exhausting. At the end of it, you feel drained, misunderstood, and strangely defeated. And the most frustrating part is this. They often appear completely energized by the exchange. This is not accidental. Narcissistic personalities often operate through what psychologists call emotional supply. They need attention, reactions, and engagement to feel powerful. It does not matter whether the reaction is positive or negative. What matters is that they are able to influence your emotional state. When you become angry, they feel powerful. When you become defensive, they feel important. When you try desperately to make them understand you, they feel in control. And the reason this works so well is because most emotionally healthy people assume conversations are meant to solve problems. We assume the other person cares about fairness or clarity. But narcissistic manipulation doesn't rely on fairness. It relies on confusion. Confusion keeps you explaining. Confusion keeps you reacting. Confusion keeps you emotionally invested in winning the argument. But the narcissist was never trying to win the argument in the first place. They were trying to win control of the emotional environment. Once you understand that, something important becomes clear. You begin to realize that your reactions are not solving the problem. They are sustaining the system. Every emotional response is another thread keeping you tied to the game. And the truth is, narcissists are incredibly skilled at provoking those reactions. They know exactly where your emotional triggers are. They know which accusations will make you defend yourself. They know which insults will make you angry. They know which moments of silence will make you uncomfortable enough to start talking again. They are not just arguing with you, they are studying you. But here is where the entire dynamic begins to shift. The moment you stop reacting the way they expect, the structure begins to crack. When someone who once argued suddenly becomes calm, it creates psychological disruption. When someone who once defended themselves now responds with quiet confidence, the narcissist loses their predictable script. Because manipulation depends on predictability. If they say something insulting and you react with anger, the pattern continues. If they accuse you of something and you rush to defend yourself, the pattern continues. But if they provoke you and you remain steady, the pattern breaks, and when that pattern breaks, something very uncomfortable begins to happen for the narcissist. They start losing control of the emotional atmosphere. For the first time, they cannot predict how the conversation will unfold. Their usual tools, provocation, blame, exaggeration, suddenly stop producing the emotional reaction they rely on. And without that reaction, their influence begins to weaken. You may even notice a shift in their behavior. Sometimes they escalate, they speak louder, they push harder, they throw bigger accusations into the conversation. To an outside observer, it might look like strength, but psychologically, escalation is often a sign of panic. Because when manipulation stops working, the manipulation stops working. The manipulation feels exposed. This is why emotional discipline is one of the most powerful forms of self-protection, not because it makes you silent and not because it means you tolerate disrespect. It is powerful because it removes the reward system that narcissistic behavior depends on. You stop feeding the cycle. You stop proving yourself to someone who has no interest in understanding you. You stop investing emotional energy in a conversation that was never meant to be fair. And when you remove those reactions, the narcissist faces something they rarely encounter, a person they cannot emotionally steer, a person who cannot be provoked easily, a person who is no longer participating in the psychological game. That moment is deeply unsettling for someone who relies on control, because once your reactions are no longer predictable, your independence becomes visible. And once that independence becomes visible, the dynamic of power quietly shifts. You are no longer reacting inside their world. You are standing outside of it. And that realization leads to a simple but powerful truth that most people learn far too late. The person who controls their emotions ultimately controls the interaction. Once you begin to understand that emotional reactions are the fuel that keeps manipulation alive, another realization begins to emerge, and it is one of the most powerful shifts a person can experience. Manipulation loses its power the moment it is clearly seen. Awareness alone can dismantle a system that once felt impossible to escape. Most manipulation works in the shadows of confusion. It survives because the target is constantly questioning themselves. They are wondering if they misunderstood the situation. They are replaying conversations in their mind. They are asking themselves whether they overreacted, whether they were unfair, whether they somehow caused the conflict. This internal questioning is exactly where the narcissist wants you to live, because when you are questioning yourself, you are not questioning them. You begin adjusting your behavior to avoid conflict. You try harder to communicate clearly. You become more patient, more careful, more accommodating, and in doing so, you unknowingly place the narcissist in a position of psychological authority over your reality. But here is the uncomfortable truth that many people slowly discover. Narcissistic manipulation is rarely about misunderstanding. It is about distortion. Facts are twisted just enough to create doubt. Conversations are remembered selectively. Intentions are misrepresented. And when you challenge those distortions, the narcissist often responds with even more confidence, as if their version of events is unquestionably true. This creates a strange and exhausting psychological environment. You start to feel like you are defending reality itself. You say, "That's not what happened." They respond, "That's exactly what happened." You provide examples. They dismiss them. You try to clarify. They reinterpret your clarify. The conversation becomes less about solving a problem and more about redefining the past in real time. And the longer this continues, the more mentally exhausting it becomes. This is why awareness is so disruptive to the entire system. When you finally recognize that the distortion is intentional, you stop chasing clarity from someone who benefits from confusion. You begin seeing patterns instead of isolated incidents. You notice how often the story changes depending on what benefits them. You notice how accountability is always redirected. You notice how the conversation somehow always ends with you defending your character while they avoid examining their own behavior. And when you see the pattern clearly, something inside you shifts. You stop asking yourself, "How do I prove them wrong?" Instead, you begin asking a more important question. Why am I trying to prove myself to someone committed to misunderstanding? That question alone can change everything, because awareness removes the illusion that the conversation is about truth. It exposes the interaction for what it actually is, a struggle for psychological control. And once that illusion is gone, you no longer feel the same pressure to participate in the argument the way you once did. You begin responding differently. Instead of explaining yourself endlessly, you become concise. Instead of chasing agreement, you focus on clarity within yourself. Instead of trying to win the conversation, you simply refuse to accept distorted narratives. And sometimes that refusal takes the form of a single sentence. A calm, direct acknowledgement that the manipulation has been seen. I understand what you're trying to do and it won't work on me. Notice something important about that statement. It does not accuse. It does not insult. It does not accuse. It does not insult. It does not escalate the conflict. It simply communicates awareness. And awareness is extremely threatening to someone who relies on psychological manipulation. Because the moment manipulation is recognized, it loses much of its effectiveness. The strategy only works when the other person is uncertain. It only works when they are emotionally invested in proving something. It only works when they believe the conversation is happening in good faith. But once you demonstrate that you see the pattern clearly, the narcissist loses one of their most valuable tools, your confusion. Now they are dealing with someone who understands the game. And when that happens, the dynamic becomes uncomfortable for them. You may notice them becoming defensive. They might attempt to redirect the conversation. They might accuse you of being cold or dismissive. They might even escalate emotionally in an attempt to regain control. But what they are truly reacting to is the loss of invisibility. Their tactics are no longer hidden. You have named the pattern without becoming emotionally entangled in it. And this is where psychological freedom begins to grow, because awareness does not just change how you respond in one conversation. It changes how you interpret the entire relationship. You stop personalizing behavior that was never about you in the first place. You stop measuring your worth against the distorted perceptions of someone who benefits from diminishing others. Instead, you begin anchoring yourself in something far more stable, your own understanding of reality. You know what happened. You know your intentions. And you no longer feel obligated to convince someone who refuses to see either one. That quiet certainty is deeply destabilizing to a narcissistic personality because manipulation depends on uncertainty. And once uncertainty disappears, so does their advantage. The moment you clearly see the pattern, the entire structure begins to collapse. Not because the narcissist suddenly changes, but because you are no longer standing in the place where their tactics once worked. And that leads to a realization that can transform the way you handle every manipulative interaction in your life. The greatest defense against manipulation is not a better argument. It is the courage to see the truth clearly and the discipline to stand in that clarity without needing anyone else to validate it. Once awareness enters the picture, something else must follow if real change is going to happen. Awareness without discipline can still leave a person trapped in the same cycle. You may see the manipulation clearly. You may recognize the patterns, but if your emotions continue to react the same way they always have, the dynamic will not truly change. That is where the final and perhaps most powerful shift occurs: calm detachment. Now, when people hear the word detachment, they oft misunderstand it. They imagine indifference, coldness, or silence. But that is not what real detachment means. Detachment is not the absence of care. It is the presence of control. It means your emotional state is no longer controlled by someone else's behavior. And this is incredibly threatening to someone who has spent years learning how to provoke reactions from people. Because narcissistic personalities depend on emotional predictability. They rely on knowing which words will trigger anger, which accusations will trigger defensiveness, and which criticisms will cause you to explain yourself. They study these patterns over time. Think about it carefully. In many toxic dynamics, the manipulator understands your emotional triggers better than you do. They know the exact phrase that will make you feel disrespected. They know the topic that makes you defensive. They know the accusation that makes you want to prove your innocence immediately. And they use those triggers strategically. But calm detachment removes those triggers from the equation. When you stop reacting impulsively, their map of control begins to disappear. This does not mean you never speak. It does not mean you tolerate disrespect. What it means is that your responses become intentional instead of emotional. You choose when to speak, how much to say, and when to walk away from a conversation that is no longer productive. That kind of composure sends a very different signal. Instead of someone who can be steered emotionally, you become someone who cannot easily be moved. And that shift often confuses the narcissist at first, because they are expecting the same pattern they have always seen. They expect the argument, they expect the frustration, they expect the long explanations, but instead they are met with calm. They throw a criticism at you, and you simply acknowledge it without emotio. Now escalation. They attempt to provoke you, and you respond briefly without feeding the conflict. They try to distort the situation, and you refuse to debate a reality that you already understand clearly. The conversation suddenly becomes very different. Not louder, just shorter. And that is one of the most powerful changes a person can make in these interactions. Narcissistic manipulation often survives on long conversations. The longer the conversation continues, the more opportunities they have to twist the narrative, redirect blame, or create confusion. But when someone begins to respond with clarity and brevity, the space for manipulation shrinks. A simple response like, "I disagree with that," delivered calmly, can be far more powerful than a 5-minute explanation. Not because the words are stronger, but because the emotional control behind them cannot easily be manipulated. And when a narcissist realizes that their usual strategies are not producing the reactions they expect, they often attempt something else. They escalate. They may become louder, more aggressive, more dramatic. They might accuse you of being cold. They might say you have changed. They might even attempt to guilt you into returning to the old pattern. But that escalation reveals something important. It shows that the old system is no longer working. When manipulation loses its emotional impact, it often tries to increase its intensity. But intensity without influence quickly becomes visible for what it really is: desperation. And this is the moment where emotional discipline matters the most, because the temptation will be to defend yourself again. The temptation will be to explain that you are not cold, that you are simply protecting your peace. But calm detachment does not require endless explanation. Your behavior speaks for itself. You are not responsible for convincing us. Omen to respect boundaries they already understand. You simply maintain those boundaries with consistency, and over time, something fascinating begins to happen. The narcissist begins to realize that the person they once influenced so easily is no longer available in the same way. The emotional doors they used to open with a few strategic words are now closed, not with anger, not with revenge, just with quiet control. And that quiet control is deeply unsettling to someone who relies on emotional dominance. Because the truth is, narcissists do not fear loud opposition nearly as much as they fear calm independence. Loud opposition still keeps them at the center of your emotional world. Calm independence removes them from that center entirely. You are no longer trying to defeat them. You are simply refusing to orbit around their behavior. And that shift changes everything. Because the real power in any relationship, conversation, or conflict belongs to the person who can remain emotionally grounded while others lose control. It is not about winning the argument. It is about refusing to let someone else dictate your internal state. And once you reach that level of calm discipline, something becomes very clear. The strongest response to manipulation is not louder words. It is a quieter mind that refuses to be controlled.